On D-Day, June 6, 1944, after passing several tense and confusing early morning hours in the cockpit of his yellow-nosed Me-109G, Leutnant Thomas Beike received his mission orders. His plane was sitting under the trees, hidden from view. With two other Bf-109Gs, he was to fly a fast reconnaissance flight over Normandy beach to assess and report on what was happening. With the engine started, he pushed the throttle forward and rolled out of his hidden, tree-lined revetment north of the French town of Évreux. He took off into a sky filled with Allied aircraft. As he retracted his wheels, a flight of American P-51D Mustangs were already curving in to attack. Within sight of his airfield, first one, then the other plane in his flight were shot down. He was alone. He put his nose down, pushed the throttle all the way to the stops, and flew on. Most know of the famous flight of Josef Priller and his wingman in a pair of FW-190A8 fighter planes. They flew down the beaches that day, with the entire Allied fleet shooting at them. For many years, Priller's flight was supposedly the only sign of the Luftwaffe on D-Day. However, we now know that Leutnant Beike also flew that day, as did the two others in his flight. Of those three pilots, only Beike survived. He took off that day from one of the hidden airfields the Luftwaffe had in Normandy. They were near Évreux, just south of Rouen, and only 90 kilometers east-southeast of the invasion beaches. Évreux had long been a Luftwaffe airfield. Originally, the pilots and crews were based at a chateau that the Luftwaffe had taken over in 1940. Leutnant Beike had been with the unit for only a few months, however, having previously been posted on the Eastern Front. As he said, I went from bedding down in a frozen hut to sleeping in a proper bed with a staff servant to attend to meals and the polishing of boots and other necessities. Once in the air, however, none of that mattered. He was flying 600 kilometers per hour, about 325 knots. The pursuing Mustangs couldn't keep up, and within 10 minutes he'd reached the beach. As he said, the coast itself just leapt up at me at that speed. And from that height, I could then see a massive line of ships out at sea, about 3 kilometers from the shore. This just happened like that. In the blink of an eye, my canopy glass was just full of these ships. I was astonished at this sight. I wondered if I was hallucinating, or if this was a delirium of some kind. I had never seen such an assembly of ships, and I'm sure nobody will ever see such a thing again, perhaps not in human history. The sea was absolutely solid with metal. That is no exaggeration. He turned to the west and passed over the beaches that the Allies had codenamed Sword in the British sector, Juno in the Canadian sector, and then Gold, the final British beachhead. Leutnant Beike later reported, I saw that the beaches were crammed with vehicles, moving in on transport barges, and even tanks were being unloaded like that. Throughout the beaches, there were fires burning, vehicles and boats on fire, and explosions from artillery. I saw flamethrowers being used inland, very powerful ones, and the flames lit up a wide area down there. The enemy were driving a bridgehead inland, that was clear to see, and they had enormous resources building up on the sand waiting to move off. I could see flashes of bombs and shells all over the inland area. I remember that some of the fields were flooded, and the exploding shells sent out concentric shock waves through the water that was very noticeable. In just 3 minutes, he had flown over all 3 of the British and Canadian beaches. The American beaches were straight ahead, but 3 P-51 Mustangs were closing in fast. The sky above was full of Allied aircraft. He described it as a low umbrella of fighters over the beach. Then he added, and they came straight for me. Nearing Arromanches, he turned southwest and headed inland, hoping to evade. He said, there were 3 coming after me. I went down to minimum height and maximum speed, which was safe because the land is so flat there and the German flak would be less likely to misidentify me, I hoped. I thought that if I could move away from the beachhead, the Mustangs would turn back to protect their sector, so I used a huge amount of fuel accelerating to the southwest. I went west as far as Saint-Lô, and I couldn't see the Americans behind me, so I turned east and followed the forest back towards Évreux. As he raced eastward across the Normandy countryside, he could see masses of German Wehrmacht troops and vehicles along the roads and spread out into the fields and in the woods. After Caen, he passed Lisieux and Bernay. When he arrived at Évreux, he could see the burning wreckage of his colleague's Messerschmitt at the end of the runway. His satellite airfield was under attack. As American fighter planes made a strafing attack, he landed and rolled to a stop, then jumped from the cockpit and ran for the cover of one of the slit trenches that were located along the side of the field. In between attacks, he jumped out of the slit trench and ran for the main shelter hidden in the trees. Once there, he submitted his reconnaissance report, only then realizing that despite having had his commander's Leica camera at his side, he had completely forgotten to take even a single photo. After multiple bombing attacks, his satellite field at Évreux was finally taken out of action. In the days that followed, he moved to another satellite airfield southeast of Évreux and was able to fly again. Then he was injured in combat and sent to a hospital in Normandy. The hospital was subsequently overrun by U.S. Army forces, and he was captured without a shot being fired. As a result, against all odds, he survived the war. By late August, the Luftwaffe airfield at Évreux was in Allied hands. Then Paris was liberated. The Allied advance was unstoppable. In all, the Allies put over 2,500 fighter aircraft into the air to support the landings on D-Day. Approximately 700 light and medium bombers were also flown, as well as hundreds of heavy bombers. With extensive attacks aimed at the Luftwaffe's airfields, the Germans could launch only a handful of aircraft. Against such overwhelming force, the Luftwaffe never had a chance, which makes Leutnant Thomas Beike's flight all the more astonishing. His report forms a unique record of what the Germans experienced in the air over the beaches, and the story of D-Day wouldn't be complete without it. It took supreme courage for him in his flight to fly that day. That brings to mind, however, what might be the ultimate question of the Second World War. How could so many Germans display such extraordinary physical courage in a time when moral courage was so rare? I'm Thomas Van Hare, and this is Historic Wings. Please share, give me a like, and subscribe. And remember, there's always more to the story.